Before we can begin using Git, we first need to install it. We could go out to the homepage of the Git open source project, and we'd find installer files there for both Mac and Windows. But a much easier way to install it is through the installation of the GitHub client, which is also available for both Mac and Windows. Not only is this going to give us the client that we're going to be using later on in the course, but it's also going to do a very quick and stable installation of Git itself, which is what we're going to use through the command line in this chapter. So in this movie, I'm going to focus on the installation and setup of the GitHub client for Mac. So if you're on a Windows machine, I would recommend skipping to the next movie where I'm going to be talking about installing it for Windows. Okay, so go ahead and in your browser, navigate to mac.github.com. And this site is pretty bare bones, actually. There is a help section right here that talks about what to do when first launching it and setting it up, that sort of thing. But pretty much this is just a site for you to come and download the client itself. So I'm going to click on the download link, and that's going to download a zip file for me. And as soon as that downloads, I'm going to open up my downloads folder, and it's just a zip file. I'm going to double-click the zip file to extract it, and as soon as I do that, there's the application. So doing an install is as simple as that. We don't need to drag a DMG file to the applications folder. There's no package to unpack and install. It just is what it is. Now, I am going to move this to my applications folder because I just kind of like it being there since it's an app. And then to launch it, I'm going to switch over to my applications, find it, and then double-click it to launch it. Now, since this is the first time I've opened the GitHub client, it wants to help me through the process of setting it up. And I'm going to let it do that. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is declutter my workspace a little bit. So forgive me for a moment while I hide the browsers and everything else that's open, just so we can focus on the client itself. Okay, so it wants to help us through the setup, and we're going to let it. So the first thing I'm going to do is hit continue. And it wants to know a little bit about me. Who am I, for example, on GitHub? So this is one of the things you want to do. You want to install this after you've already set up an account on GitHub. So I'm going to go ahead and give it my login. And that would be the username that I set up earlier. And then my password. And then I'll go ahead and sign in. Now, if you signed in successfully, you'll see your username. If you have a Gravatar icon, you'll see that as well. And of course, if you have an enterprise account with GitHub, you can set that up. But I'm guessing that if you have an enterprise account, you probably already have a setup guide. All right, if I hit continue, it's going to take me on to the next thing, which is setting up my git config file. Now, we're going to set the git config file up manually through the use of the terminal in just one moment as soon as we're done with this. But it doesn't hurt to show you kind of how all this works. And it's nice because it shows you how to do it within the client as well as do it manually through terminal. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is enter my name in. Now, I could leave my username in there, but when I make a commit or a contribution or respond to something, I'd like my actual name to show up. So I'm going to put my name as James Williamson, and then I'm going to enter the email, and this is going to be the same email that I used for the account itself. So remember earlier I said, hey, write that down, you're going to need it. This is when you're going to need it. Now, the next thing I want to do before I hit continue is there's a little button down here that says install command line tools. And I'll be honest with you, I wish that button were larger and like orange or red or something to really prompt people to do this, because here's the deal. Not only is it going to install GitHub, but it's going to install Git. And in terms of using Git through the command line, through the use of terminal or something like that, if you don't have some of these command line tools installed, which are a dependency of Git, then Git won't work properly. I learned that the hard way. On my laptop, I have Xcode installed, but I didn't have it on another machine that I was working on. So I just did a manual install of Git, started working, nothing worked. I couldn't figure it out. It took me a long time to figure out that I needed those command line tools. This is one of my favorite features of the GitHub client. Not only does it install Git for you, but it offers the ability to install the command line tools dependency, and I'm going to take advantage of that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and install those. And I heartily recommend that you do the same thing. All right, I'm going to hit continue, and it's going to ask me, what local repositories would you like to use? Well, I don't have any, so I don't have any to choose from. But if you already had some existing Git repositories, you would see them show up in kind of like a list, and you could check the ones you wanted to add. Although if you have local Git repositories, you'd probably want to add all of them, I'm guessing. So I'm going to hit done. And as soon as I hit done, this is the GitHub client. Now, we're going to come back to the GitHub client a little bit later on in the course. But right now, I want to focus on how to do things manually through Git using the terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to my client for just a little while. Don't worry, we will be back. And I'm going to launch my terminal window. Now, if you're installing Git manually, not through the use of the GitHub client, there's a lot of things that you have to do to configure it manually. And if you're interested in reading an article about that, if you just log into your GitHub account, you can go to either right here on the front page where it says Set Up Git, or you can go to Help, set up Git. Either one will take you to the exact same article where there is a download for the client that we just installed, actually. But if I scroll down, it talks about the commands that we need to actually set up the config file the way that we just set it up in the client. And if I scroll down, there's even a little section on password caching, and we're going to set that up for those of us that are on the Mac. It's really handy to have that set up. So again, I'm going to open up my terminal window, and I'm just going to go ahead and set some config settings. I'm going to type in git config -- global. So that tells Git that I want it to be my global configuration for all repositories, not just one. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to type in user.name and then followed by my name. Now this probably looks familiar to you, and you're probably saying, wait, didn't we just do this? We did, absolutely. But it's helpful to know how these things are done within the terminal as well, because later on in this chapter, we're going to be doing things totally through the terminal and not through the client at all. So this is just sort of to get our feet wet, if you will. All right. I'm going to do git config again. -- global, and this time user.email. And again, that's going to be followed by the email account that I used when I signed up. We're actually overriding what we did just a moment ago, so you want to make sure you type that in all correctly. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is set up a credential helper. The reason that I want to do this, and this is actually something that was done sort of behind the scenes for us with the GitHub client, is every time I come into this terminal and let's say I want to connect to a remote repository on GitHub, the first time I do it, I'm going to have to enter in my username and password just so it knows who I am, who I say I am. But by setting up the credential helper, we're only going to have to do that one time and not every time we connect to it. So this is actually a pretty nice step. All right, I'm going to type in git config -- global again. So you can see all these sort of config settings are about the same. So next is credential .helper. And the credential helper that we're going to use, so there's a space there, is the OS 10 or OS X keychain, and that's all one word. Let me make this a little bit wider so you can see how that all looks on one line. And as soon as I hit return, it's going to say OK. So now, if I wanted to check to make sure all that was done properly, I could do git config -- list, and it would give me my username, my email, and my credential helper, which is the OS 10 keychain. Fantastic. By the way, if you enter in the credential helper and you double check the syntax and you make sure you've typed everything right and you still get an error message, check out the GitHub article on setting this up. Occasionally you'll need to download a dependency in order to run this. Most of you guys are not going to deal with this, but just in case that happens, make sure you come over to this article and it shows you the steps to how to download the dependency for that. Okay, so now we've set up both the GitHub client and Git itself. It's time for us to start exploring the basics of using Git, and we're going to start in the next movie by looking at an overview of how Git works.